As befits the ethos of theater that we're going to be discussing, I suspect that I'm going to conduct my part of these proceedings in stage whispers because my throat's kind of going. But that being said, Amal, I want to congratulate you in the first place for the truly extraordinary endeavor. And I hope we'll talk about this as we go along. You have responded to this absolutely titanic figure who also was your father. So you write as a daughter, as someone who was his student, who worked with him at the NSD, who succeeded him. And all of these different worlds, personal and public, come together in really quite amazing ways. And to just create a bit of a context, it's interesting that as we come up to his centennial, which is next year, in the last few years, there have been some attempts in the direction of accounting for this long, varied, and very rich life. Some years ago, at your invitation, when you rediscovered his early drawings and paintings, I curated an exhibition at Art Heritage, and in the process of that, we began to see how, in addition to encouraging other people and creating institutions, he also had begun as an artist himself, as a very innovative painter with a literary imagination informed by mythology and anthropology, many of the things that also then went into his theater making. Then there was your brother Faisal's book on your father. And now this book seems also to extend the canvas in certain ways to include the deep family history going all the way back to Arabia. So let me just plunge into that part of it. Could you talk to us a little bit about the research that went into, we'll come to the Bombay part, but reconstructing the deeper background in the Arabian Peninsula, the world from which Alkazi and his family emerged. And I've always been fascinated by how the village he came from is also pretty much where a very austere form of Wahhabism originated. So it's incredible that on the other hand, you have this master of the expressive emerging from the same kind of background.
Well, my father's Arab background is something that really always intrigued me because it was something very unknown. While he was living in India, while he was with us at home, he rarely really talked about his Arab background. It was only much later that one began to explore where he came from. So although I knew my cousins who were in Bombay, who were living over there, there were other members of the family, we didn't really talk about the roots of Saudi Arabia. And I think even for Alkazi, it was only much later that he started to, I think, in a way, accept being an Arab in India. Being an Arab in India, I don't think for him was at all an easy task, especially since he had set himself out to do something for Indian theatre. He wanted to become an Indian. He wanted to seep himself in the culture of the country, and that actually you see in stages. But going back to my grandfather, very interesting, is that we came to know, and I came to know of his story really through my aunts. Because when I started visiting Kuwait, where a lot of the family is, etc., they started telling me about the background of my father and where my grandfather, etc., came from. These stories were not told to me by my father. He only talked about them very rarely. So, but I felt it is important to begin this book with the trudging of his father walking across the desert and coming to Basra, and from Basra catching a boat and coming to India. Very poor man. A man of absolutely no means at all, and setting himself up in Bombay finally in the spice trade. He was a spice trader. So, but my grandfather was obviously an adventurer because he had made this long journey, and now that he was in India, he began himself to feel that his children should embrace India. India was a very welcome country. It was welcoming. So he settled them all down, sent them to schools, and had a very broad mind because he started sending them to Jesuit schools, etc., where they learnt English. So is your answer incomplete yet? My answer.
We'll circle round to
We'll
more.
circle round to
But let me move also to the other part of the family now, the clan Padamsee, so to speak.
Yes.
And to certainly someone of my generation growing up in Bombay, your family history is sort of part of the lore of the cultural sphere.
Yeah.
I remember getting to know it very, very early indeed through Nissim Ezekiel, who was my guru. He was your father's great friend. Through other people who had worked with your father, although they may not have gone into theatre otherwise, but people like Melly Gobai from the theatre group days, Geev Patel from the theatre unit days. So let me draw you out now on that, because you stopped with the Arab part of the story at that point of coming into a certain kind of modernity, if you will. Now, the Padamsees had their own journey towards, if you will, a certain kind of modernity coming out of a Dawoodi Bohra background. So could you talk a little bit about that?
We are not Dawoodi Bohras.
Sorry.
We are Ismaili Khojas.
Ismaili Khojas, I'm sorry. That was a mind fade completely.
Yes.
For some reason,
Yeah,
Tayyab was in mind.
Yeah. So yes, the Padamsees of Bombay, who were earlier from Gujarat, etc., had traveled and settled down. And I had the important person in our family was my grandmother, who was a person who was really rooting that her big clan, and both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side, both had 9 children each there. So I have 9 uncles and aunts on this side and 9 uncles and aunts on the other. So we are a very large family. So she was very insistent that her children, Kulsumbai Padamsee, was very insistent that her children study abroad. But in the absence of studying abroad, they studied with 2 Irish sisters who had set up a private boarding school at Pedder Road, Altamont Road in Bombay. And this is where all the children were sent from a very tiny age, hardly 2 or 3. She'd have a child and send them off to the boarding school. So they had a very proper heading towards senior Cambridge kind of education with Miss Murphy's School. It was called Miss Murphy's School. And her eldest son, and this is the mentor of Alkazi, the mentor of Alkazi was Sultan Padamsee, whose other name was Bobby. So Sultan and all of them had pet names which were very anglicized. So all members of the family were Bubbles and Chotu and Bobby and Jerry and Bee. These were all the names given by the Anglo-Indian or the Irish spinsters to these children. And Sultan Padamsee, most brilliant of the lot, had gone to study at Oxford, returned because of the war, and then set up base at the St. Xavier's College in Bombay. This is where my father really met him. So my father was part of the Dramatic Society over there. But both sides of the family, I was always intrigued, which had so many artistic people emerging out of them. Even my father's family had a lot of people emerging out of them who became artists. My father's elder brother, another brother was Basil Alkazi, who is an artist, who is still alive. Munira Alkazi, his sister, who's a very well-known and one of the first Arab artists. And on the Padamsee side too, there were a lot of artists, although they are coming from real business families. So that was quite unusual, but the aspirations were always there, and they somehow had parents who kind of furthered this interest in them. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember last year seeing Munira Alkazi's work at the Mathaf Museum in Doha,
Yes.
which was part of a historical survey of art in Beirut.
Right.
So it was wonderful to think of how this family was transcultural in many ways, extending across Karachi, Beirut, the Mediterranean, and the UK, and later the US.
Right.
So there's something, there's an impulse of wandering on the Alkazi side. But I'm thinking now of the Padamsee side. Your mother's cousin, Akbar, for instance, he used to talk often to us about how the Ismailis had this confluential past that up until recently, the ginans that they would sing had
Yes.
very, very strong Vaishnav elements. So there already was a certain kind of crossover in this background
Right.
that you inherited.
Right.
And to that, I want to link this episode of how just before Bobby, and I hope you'll talk about the circumstances of his passing before he died, he had asked your father to go through a rigorous training in Kathakali
Right.
and was beginning to be interested in Tagore.
Right.
So there's a form of thinking which sees the Padamsis and particularly Bobby as being very westernized. But I'm also intrigued by the way in which they were very committed to a certain emerging sense of being embedded in the modernities that were developing in India. So do you want to talk a little about that period?
Yes,
Which would be the late 40s?
yes. In fact, Bobby Padamsi has a very interesting article which he had, I don't know, written, but it's handwritten in one of his notebooks, which I managed to get hold of, where he has a discussion between Eastern and Western art and feels that the Indian artist can never aspire to be realistic and doesn't have it in him, but would definitely be elaborating on a theme rather than going into an individual. It's a very interesting article, and it is, I think, around the same time, and actually I have put that, the words from that article have been used as dialogues in this book, because I have used a lot of what they said in writing, I have converted them into dialogues as they speak to one another in the book. And it is actually just the day before Bobby dies that he is having a discussion with Alkazi on this very topic of what is Eastern and what is Western. And it is at this time that he is rehearsing Chitra by Tagore. Bobby is rehearsing Chitra by Tagore, his first Indian play. And he has cast Alkazi in one of the roles, and Alkazi is now learning Kathakali. So we're talking about 1946, Bombay, and that already people from a so-called westernized background were looking back, and definitely, I think, towards the Bengal school and towards Tagore for this East-West mixture, and I think fusion, and coming to some kind of realization. And also Uday Shankar is very much around. He's traveling all over the world and bringing some of these ideas. So it's a very fertile, rich period at this time. And I think this, Alkazi never forgot about the fact that he was in Chitra. And he refers to it in several interviews that it was Bobby Padamsi who planted the idea in his mind that we have to go back to our roots and go back to our own culture in order to create a new culture for the future.
I also want to draw you out on the simultaneity of Alkazi's activities through his Bombay period.
Right.
Both in theatre, but also in the visual arts. He was, in the best sense, what used to be called an impresario before the term curator became so current. But there was also always a pedagogical impulse. I'm thinking of the series of exhibitions called What is Modern Art? This is Modern Art. So could you talk a little bit also about what it was like to be both involved in these events, but looking back, how do you see this? Because there's that pedagogical role which then assumes great prominence later, but it was somehow always there, this need to reach out to an audience and educate it in some ways.
Absolutely. Alkazi was always interested in the audience. He was always interested in the students and the audience. These were the two large communities whom he was going to teach. And Alkazi, right from the beginning, right from the days he returned from DADA, and actually even while he was in England, and I think the very exciting part of this book is to unearth what Alkazi learnt abroad. What he learnt and what he brought back and what he modified and what he tried to make relevant to Indian actors and to an Indian audience. Growing up in this kind of background, I myself never knew the difference between us in our house making an exhibition or my father preparing to mount an exhibition or to mount a play. There was no difference for us. It was all art. It was all part of the same thing. So in my consciousness, I've never sort of divided the two because I didn't grow up in those circumstances. We had actors in the home. We had so-called artists like Nissim Ezekiel in the home. We had painters in the home. And for me, they were all, again, one group of what one would call artists. So there was no differentiation. But where Alkazi really to try and do an exhibition called This is Modern Art in 8 episodes at Jahangir Art Gallery, and that too taking over both the galleries, such a huge exhibition without many actual works of art. There were no works of art, I mean, other than prints to be put up on the wall. But he did a whole series of exhibitions, beginning with the Impressionists and ending, I think, with Picasso, purely through this idea of being able to cut up from magazines. We didn't even have the money to actually buy prints, but we used to cut up from magazines. I remember sitting on the floor and cutting up magazines, etc., and helping my father mount these in beautiful blue mounts, which he did. And I think his whole idea really came, as you know, from André Malraux's idea of the imaginary museum, the museum of the imagination, that people all over the world don't have the means, even museums don't have the means, to show works of art next to one another from different eras. And so therefore, the one way of doing it is to reproduce them and to photograph them. So I think he built on this idea and was able to do. So, yes.
You know, there's now a mythology about how in the early decades of post-colonial India, we were all rather sad and diffident and so on. It's only now that apparently we are greatly confident. But when I think back to this very heroic first generation of post-colonial figures, Alkazi prominent among them, what you find is an incredible confidence. And even if you don't know where you're heading to, the notion of being a quester is very important. So these were the early days of the Jahangir Art Gallery, which had just been created. Yeah, and Durga Bajpayee, who had come back from studying with Alvar Aalto, builds that museum. It was in many, many ways a great wager on being global.
Right.
And we don't give ourselves enough credit for having achieved that in 1952.
Absolutely.
So in that context, I've also always been amazed at how your father was, when he went out to Britain, because he felt he needed to train at the heart of empire, the institution that he signed up with, he found irrelevant, and then he went out and recrafted what he wanted to study. Yes. But a very important role in all of this was played by your mother, Roshan, who I never ever called Roshan in life. She was always Mrs. Alkazi to me. In many ways, this book is a portrait of both your parents, although it appears under the sign of your father. Could I draw you out on that lifelong partnership in many, many ways from the earliest days to later?
Yeah, well, it was an absolutely close partnership. I mean, my mother was the sister of his mentor, Bobby Padamsi's sister, my mother, Roshan. And she had already been introduced to the world of theatre by her brother, Bobby. Bobby encouraged her to learn dance. Bobby encouraged her to become a costume designer. And so Roshan, hardly from the age, I mean, all her life, had spent with this very, very artistic brother, and now she falls in love with Alkazi, and they actually have to take on the work that Bobby Padamsi had begun. And so Alkazi is just totally distressed. He doesn't know how to take on this mantle of Bobby, who is an extroverted personality, a very sort of a Orson Welles kind of huge personality. And Alkazi is a shy person. He is not at all confident of himself. But Roshan helps him. Roshan now, who has been the lieutenant of Bobby in many, many ways, as now goes on to help her husband. And she is a great collaborator. She is totally, my mother was totally selfless in support of art, any form of art. not just theatre, but also much later she became a gallerist and was totally devoted to art. She always responded to painting. Her brother was also a painter. Bobby was a painter. And Akbapa Damsi, as he has mentioned, is her first cousin. So they're all part of a, Khoja community, very interesting for that period of time, who are now, stopping to be landlords or owners of buildings or owners of some kind of trade and are moving into the arts. So I would say that she was the person who understood my father the best. She understood his work, and as I've quoted in the book many times, she has told me that she never missed a single rehearsal. He would not rehearse without her sitting in the room. He would ask her opinion. And then, of course, in later years, the partnership was so close that I don't think they really had to he didn't have to say, well, I think this play needs this kind of costume. Because she already knew the lines in which he was growing and developing. But she played a very masterful role because I think she was also his most severe critic. She criticized his work. She was very astute visually, very astute in understanding the deeper meanings of the plays that he was doing, and supported him. And to the extent that when he broke away from the theatre group, broke away from the Padamsee family, then my mother, of course, supported my father. The Alec and the rest of the theatre group were on one side, which comes across quite strongly, I think, in the book, that there's a division in the family because Alkazi walks out. Alkazi says, I don't think that you understand what kind of theatre that I want to do, so I'm going ahead to do the kind of theatre I want to do, but you are most welcome to join me or leave me. And he was very categorical. You were talking about the risks that he was taking. They were always very categorical. Either you were with him or against him. My father was a man of that kind of thinking. Either you had to be, there was no gray area. So he said, either you come or you leave, and don't tell me you want to act in my plays because the answer is no. You have to believe in the philosophy I believe in. And I believe that only one man, and he was very clear about that only one man can run an institution with a chiseled vision. He was democratic, but his democracy stopped, somewhere. And he took over, and because he felt that you cannot have conflicting interests. Basically, it was a question of interests. And his interest was always in the interest of the student, nothing else.
I think over the years of working with figures like your father, I've kind of evolved a term for this, consultative dictatorship. So I think, but in his case, it worked brilliantly. It doesn't always do that. But whilst we're speaking of this, I thought we could maybe dwell on questions of form a little. 2 or 3 things that came to me. One is that whilst it is a biography, it also is your memoir, because you are so deeply implicated in it. So could you talk to us a little bit about the liberties you have taken, for instance, in terms of, it's creative liberties. You've reconstructed dialogue, that's one.
Yes, yes.
And also the way in which, in the Alkazi tradition, you have these extensive archives. But there's also so much that has never been put to paper. You're drawing on memory, you're drawing on oral history of certain kinds. Those 2 things come together, the written, printed record and everything else that has never been put down to paper.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about what this meant for you in crafting and structuring the book?
Yes, this was a big question because being a theatre director myself, the moment I get material in my hand, it becomes a scene in a play. So it becomes a scene that I immediately construct it into a scene. So all my memories were getting constructed into sequences and scenes of things which had left an imprint in my mind. And then I tried to Like, for example, I have taken the liberty many, many times, and actually my editor has reminded me that how far we could go or not go in this kind of liberty, because I have put words into Francis Newton Sousa's mouth as if he said them, or Nissim Ezekiel's mouth as if he said them, and my parents' mouths as if they said them. And all the scenes, because I'm trying to construct something live. I'm not trying to talk about history, oh, this happened, that happened, because I'm not assessing Alkazi. This book is not about assessing Alkazi at all. It is about, as he says, a memoir, but I think really I was interested in process. I wanted to see how he became something, or how he arrived at a certain idea. I was not really interested in talking about his great vision and all the achievements which many people have talked about. So this was something from the inside, what I heard, and I did take liberties. I reconstructed scenes. So there are scenes which I believe never took place, may not have taken place, but the material in them is there. The material is something which I've grasped, but I've had to put it in a scenario. And the way I dealt with the material, Ranjit, was really what was personal to me and what is public. These two things I had to dance between. I had to dance between being the chronicler of my father and dance between being my daughter. So sometimes I say, I refer to him as Ebrahim, sometimes I refer to him as Elk, sometimes I refer to him as Alkazi, and then I refer to him as my father. So, you know, when it becomes my father, it is obviously a sequence which is rather intimate and personal. And when I refer to him as Elk, it is normally maybe my mother's point of view or friend's point of view, and Alkazi was the name he was known by. And Ibrahim always to his family. His family never called him Elk. They always called him Ibrahim. So, you know, we lived in many countries, and he moved between several countries, and so he had these different kind of differentiations whereby, you know, names by which he was known.
There's also, I'm trying to figure out a good way of saying this. There's a dance, as you put it, between delicacy and candor.
Yes.
Because when you're writing a chronicle like this, which is really a memoir, there are many, many things that are naughty and difficult in the life of a family.
Yes.
So could you perhaps talk to us about how you arrived at certain decisions, what could be now committed to paper and, you know, is available for public view?
Yes.
And what was it like to revisit some of these phases?
It was a highly emotional experience. Let's say that, you know, it was very emotional writing about my parents at times. At times, of course, it was not. But writing about their private life, writing about the fact that there was another woman in my father's life, this I had decided not to avoid. It cannot be avoided. When you are writing a biography, you are committing yourself to a certain extent to veracity, to truth, to fidelity, to being outspoken. And so I did find it extremely difficult. And then the way I went around it was to really, in the triangular relationship that the three of them had, Uma, Anand, my mother, and my father, it is because of what I knew. I did not know of the relationship between Uma, Anand, and my father as deeply, of course, as the relationship between my mother and my father. And so, therefore, I have tended to look at the perspective from my mother's point of view. It has become, because I felt she was a very, very powerful woman, very quiet woman, but a very determined woman, and overcoming tremendous odds. She was actually the person who believed in art. She believed that art was even beyond life, important for the future. She was a great believer in art. So it was very difficult to write about these things, but I said I must put them out there, and it is for people to understand that seeing the trials and tribulations of trying to come to an understanding of of the relationship between the three was their attempt at being true, at being frank, of living the truth. The whole point in their relationship was that it was not hidden. It was out there for everyone to see. Everyone knew where my father lived. Everyone knew. But he had and she had the kind of personality that did not allow people to look on their lives with any kind of moral judgment. If they did, and I mean for Faisal and me growing up in such a household, it became an avenue towards freedom of a kind. After all, everyone in those days was talking about freedom, about being liberated, and here they were talking about sexual liberation. They were talking about relationships that can go beyond marriage, but which have to be accepted. It was difficult.
And there's also, of course, the very public aspect of your father as an institution builder, which you've
Yes.
traced through the book.
Yes,
That is much more a matter of public record, sifting through the archive.
yes.
But that surely involves, not assessment of his work, but thinking through his legacy,
Yes.
which then manifested itself in theater, through his students into cinema.
Yes, and I think what is really interesting for me is that it just happened on its own, that I really navigated trying to get to know what kind of a person my father was. I did not know him. I have begun to know him now. It's a sort of a revisiting of him and my mother in a way, and through his art, through understanding what he was doing in these early paintings, which you have curated the show for, to looking at his collections, by studying his editorials in the various things that he wrote. So it is actually through his own words, his own vision, I was trying to understand what was his idea of life. Not starting with life and ending with art, but beginning with art. In Alkazi's case, you have to do it the other way around. You have to go to the art first to understand the person. And I think at this juncture, I wanted to just make a point, because we have students of Alkazi sitting right here, and they will understand that Alkazi was not training people to be actors and technically proficient actors, though they did turn out to be wonderful actors. But he was trying to train artists to become artists, to have the temperament of an artist. And that is something very, very different from being able to speak properly, or to, declaim properly, or to walk across the stage with a certain amount of grace, etc., and to understand rhythm and tempo and stuff like that. So he was, though the technique was always important, it was the temperament that he was trying to build of the other person. It was the temperament of the audience that he was trying to inculcate, so that they could read more into art. So that they could read art, to read a visual language. His second, after teaching for so many years, the first lot of years was spent teaching actors. The second lot of years was spent teaching an audience to read art through the multiple exhibitions that he mounted at Art Heritage. In the second part of his career, he is a man who had like two complete careers.
So speaking of the audience, that is probably the cue to invite responses, questions from the house.
Yes.
Well, let's start with you. You had your hand up first, and then you there, and then.
Yes, thank you so much for such a wonderful discussion. Really enjoyed it, and I look forward to reading the book. I'm just very intrigued with the title, Holding Time Captive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Holding Time Captive, actually it was very, very difficult to come up with the title for this book for the longest time. But Holding Time Captive is that I have written this actually right in the beginning of the book. There's a short note on the title, is that on the day my father passed away, which was the 4th of August, 2020, and you know, it was COVID, and we were all, just the family was sitting around, my brother, his wife, my husband, my children, my grandchildren. We were all sitting together and we were feeling very lost. And all of a sudden, I found a scrap. I just opened one of the drawers. I was sitting at my desk where I've been writing this book now for so many years. And I just opened the desk and I found, as I have found throughout this process, magical moments. Magic happened. And a scrap of paper came out with my hand written by my father. My father, when he grew older, his hand started shaking. So his beautiful handwriting, all shaking. And he says in that piece of paper, he's trying to put his thoughts together about time and about life. And this fell out on the day, and part of those sentences were I am trying to hold time captive. It would be wonderful to hold time captive. My father was a man who passionately loved to live, and he would have loved to live for another 100 years, and he would have done more things, and you know, been you know, greater than he already is. And so those words came out. And so I said, those are the apt words for this book.
Did you have a question?
name.
Yeah.
Mrs. Allana, very endearing to hear you talk about something so personal. So thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted to know, I mean, since the work is very personal to you, is there any particular chapter or scene which holds a special meaning to you? And if you could maybe tell us why it's special to you.
Okay. I'll tell you just a very, you know, we have gone into art and depth, etc. But I have to tell you the other side of my father. He was a comedian. He was comic. He was a great actor. By the way, my father began as an actor. He didn't begin as a director. So he's a great actor. He could, at a moment's notice, put on a role, and if you ever asked him to, and he was in the mood, he would, you know, impersonate other people very, very well. But this incident, which is a tiny part of one serious chapter, I thought this chapter is going to be so serious, I want to have a light element here, bring out his comedy over here. So I recounted an anecdote and an incident which my father and Uma had once sat down and told me. So they said we went to a party, and we went to this party, and Dr. Pran Talwar was having a party at his house, and you know, and it was supposed to be very informal. It was for big, you know, doctors from all over the world. Dr. Pran Talwar was having a party, and he was introducing all his artist friends. Hussain Saab was there, and Alkazi was there, and various people. And so he Pran wanted to make this very informal, so he said, bush shirt only. So, you know, dress code, bush shirt only. So my father decided, being Alkazi, he decided, he knocked on the door, and you will see it's in the book, and, oh, said Pran, hello Alkazi, so good to see you, aiye, come in, come in, come in. And he says, these are my friends, and this is the great director of the National School of Drama. And he started introducing Alkazi. And everyone started gradually say, oh yes, and then suddenly their eyes went down. And they saw that Alkazi was not wearing any trousers. So Pran had not noticed this. Alkazi just wore his shirt. And so Pran noticed this and said, oh my God, Alkazi, do you need to go to the toilet bathroom or something? You've forgotten something. No, no, he said. My dad sprang into the room and said, no, no, Pran, you said bush shirt only, so I am following instructions.
Which is a glorious episode and a memory to go out on. Gosh, thank you all so very much. We've hit shawl time, but maybe just one last
more
question.
Please. Short one.
Is there a mic that can travel?
Thanks, Amala, for this beautiful memoir. But I want to ask something. There's wonderful work that the Alkazi Foundation is doing. And is there something did he have some kind of a vision that you really think you are taking forward? Because in the current context, it's crucial, the kind of work on cultural history that the foundation has undertaken and needs to do more.
So, do you feel
that... was this
Alkazi always thought futuristically. You know that very well. He always didn't think for the present. He always thought of what would be required many, many years down the line. And it was, I think, one of his last wishes and what he achievements is to put together this glorious archive of photographs of the whole period pre-independence from 1857 downwards. And because for him photographs were history. History should be read through photographs, he felt. So he made this massive collection. And yes, of course, it is very, very important because the Archives Alkazi Foundation draws not only scholars on art, but scholars, anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists. They all come and find material which they have to grapple with in the archives. So the archives is very active, and the archives, of course, is producing a lot of books all the time in collaboration, also singularly. So like one of the books will be out tomorrow over here, which is a collaboration of the Alkazi Foundation.
Thank you so much, Amal, and thank you all for being here.